Come down off the ladder, wash out that paintbrush, shake the sand out of your shoes, get up off your muddy knees and give the garden a morning off. Fold up the newspaper, turn off the coffee pot, close up your calendar already filled with dates and times and people and places that claim you. This church is ready for you to fill its rooms, to create its spirit, to generate its warmth, to kindle its light. This church is ready for you to make community, to create beauty, to bend it toward justice, to serve its ideals. This church is ready for you to be here. Honoring our past, invigorating our present, and dreaming our future. This is your church. Here we are home. Here we are whole. Let us begin. As is our custom, if you would like to come and light a candle for any personal joy or woe, or just to add a little more light to the world, please do so while we sit in silence, listening to the prelude. Please rise in body or spirit for our chalice lighting and spoken affirmation. We come together each week, bound not by a creed, or a mutual desire to please one God or many gods. Yet we are drawn together by a belief that how we are in the world, who we are together, matters. We light this chalice together in the knowledge that love, not fear, can change the world. Join me as together we remind ourselves of the affirmation that is a cornerstone of our free faith tradition. The words, should you need them, are in the morning program. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth and freedom, and to help one another. You may be seated. Carlton Pearson is a well-known preacher who was a protege of the late televangelist Oral Roberts. That is, until the Reverend Pearson declared himself to be Christian Universalist. He was then reviled and denounced as a heretic and was no longer welcome among his former colleagues and friends. He writes the following in his 2006 book, The Gospel of Inclusion. My daddy is in hell. Those were the words of the presiding bishop who had just denounced me as a modern-day heretic. How long has he been there? I asked quietly. He's been there over 10 years. Has he learned his lesson by now? I don't know, replied the bishop. I adored him. He was my hero. But he was abusive to me and my mother. He was unfaithful and irresponsible, but I loved him. I asked softly, have you forgiven him? Yes, I forgave him there and then on the spot. How about your Heavenly Father? Do you not think he could have forgiven your dad as well? The bishop paused a few seconds and blurted out, I don't know. I didn't relent. You say your dad's been in hell, weeping, wailing, gnashing his teeth for some 10 years now, eh? Sir, if there was a way you could get your daddy out of hell, would you? After an unexpectedly long pause, he replied again, I don't know. I queried further, you said you loved him and forgave him. Are you telling me that even if you could, you wouldn't get your dad out of hell? Even more astonishing to me, he retorted again, I don't know. It was at that very moment that I knew, without question, that the religious system I had embraced all my life was badly broken and was in no way representative of the God and Christ I had loved and served all my life. My religion was terminally ill.
Spirit, harvest the power. Our separate fires will kindle one flame. Witness the mystery of this hour. Our trials in this life appear all the same. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit of heart and mind. Seeds for the sowing are laid in store. Nurtured in love, conscious refined, with body and spirit united once more. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit growing in awe, drawn by the moon, fed by the sun. Winter to spring, summer to fall,
The Reverend J. Mark Worth, a longtime Unitarian Universalist minister, writes about the first questions he had about Bible stories from his Sunday school class. A well-meaning Methodist Sunday school teacher accidentally converted me to Unitarianism, probably when I was 12 years old in 1960 or so. It happened in a Sunday school class in Detroit, Michigan. We had an all-boy class. Hoping to get the attention of a group of 12-year-old boys, Mr. Rowe, our teacher, decided to teach us the story of Samson, the great biblical superhero. According to the Bible, Samson was given supernatural strength by God. In one story, Samson was tied up with ropes when he faced an army of Philistines. Flexing his muscles like the Incredible Hulk, he broke free of the ropes and, armed only with the jawbone of an ass, he slaughtered the entire army of 1,000 Philistines. One man, tied up, broke free and managed to kill 1,000 well-armed soldiers. Even Superman never did that. Because the Philistines couldn't beat Samson in battle, they bribed his girlfriend Delilah. She discovered that the secret of Samson's strength was that he never cut his hair. So Delilah shaved his head while he slept and then turned him over to the Philistines. Samson, now bald, was just like a normal human. The Philistines bound him, blinded him, and put him to work turning a great grindstone, grinding wheat. But the Philistines were slow to learn. Foolishly, they let his hair grow back. And as his hair grew, God gave him his strength back. So one day, when the Philistines were in their temple, praising their god, Dagon, they brought Samson into the temple in order to mock him. But Samson pulled down the pillars of the temple, killing himself and the Philistines as well. I'm sure Mr. Rowe thought the story of Samson would get the attention of our group of 12-year-old boys. And it got my attention. 55 years later, I still remember the details. But I had a question. In public school, we were studying Greek mythology and had learned the study of Heracles, whom the Romans called Hercules. And so I asked, my teacher at school said that we don't have to believe that Hercules really did all those things. It's a myth. How is Samson different than Hercules? Mr. Rose said, the story of Samson is true because it's in the Bible. And it was at that moment I became a Unitarian. Well, I didn't have a word for it. I'd never heard of Unitarians, and to my knowledge had never met one. But I could not accept Mr. Rowe's literal interpretation of the Bible. I didn't know much, but I knew that our strength is in our good health in general and our muscles in particular, not our hair.
us each to see how we move through the winds of eternity. Light shining, illuminate our inward view. Help us to see with clarity. Shine bright and true, so we may join our songs in new sounds that become full
Please turn to responsive reading number 466 in the Gray Hymnal. Let religion be to us life and joy.
Let it be a voice of renewing challenge to the best we have and may be. Let it be a call to generous action.
Let religion be to us a dissatisfaction with things that are, which bids us to serve more eagerly the true and light.
Let it be the sorrow that opens for us the way of sympathy, understanding, and service to suffering humanity.
Let religion be to us the wonder and lure of that which is only partly known and understood.
An eye that glories in nature's majesty and beauty, and a heart that rejoices in deeds of kindness and of courage.
Let religion be to us security and serenity because of its truths and beauty, and because of the enduring worth and power of the loyalties which it engenders.
Let it be to us hope and purpose, and a discovering of opportunities to express our best through daily tasks.
Religion, uniting us with all that is admirable in humans everywhere.
Holding before our eyes the prospect of a better life for humankind, which each may help to take action.
Please join me in a minute of silence. The Reverend Dr. Tony Larson is Minister Emeritus of Olympia Brown UU Church in Racine, Wisconsin. Here he offers some ideas on why not to be a Unitarian Universalist. These excerpts are from a sermon he delivered, which he titled, Why You Should Not Be a Unitarian Universalist. My friends, not everyone can be a Unitarian Universalist. Not everyone should be a Unitarian Universalist, because the first criterion for getting into this church is you've got to know how to sin. That's very important to us, and not everyone knows how to do it. We don't want people here who never do wicked things. We don't want people here who are holier than thee or thou. We don't want people who have made it past in the salvation department and are just waiting around to get picked up, because people with too much heaven in them are hell to live with. Now, don't get me wrong. If there were any perfect human beings around, we might let them in. But since there aren't any, anyone who claims they don't do wicked things is either trying to fool others or trying to fool themselves. It is the nature of the human to be evil as well as good. And you should not be a Unitarian Universalist if you're not willing to admit that about yourself. As a matter of fact, recognition of your evil has great power for mobilizing compassion. I say that from my experience in counseling. Some of the best therapists are the ones who know how to sin a little, maybe a lot. They're more tolerant of the human condition. They react with compassion rather than with self-righteousness, with understanding instead of judgment. Now, if you think you're too good, you won't like it here. But with a little bit of hypocrisy and selfishness and deceit, you'll do fine. We're not asking you to try to develop those qualities, because you don't need to. Each and every one of you already has them. We're just asking you to recognize them in yourself. It'll do wonders for your tolerance of others' foibles. The second reason for not being a Unitarian Universalist has to do with our intolerance of intolerance. You should not be a Unitarian Universalist if you support the Nazis or the KKK or any other group that believes in oppressing people. We may be open in this church, but we're not that open. We are closed to things like closure. That is, we are closed to movements or groups that close people off. And when we say our church has freedom of belief, we mean that in a limited kind of way. You are free to believe whatever you want here, but only as long as it helps you live a caring and humane life. Or at least doesn't prevent you from living a caring life. That's a very real limitation on freedom of belief. So when someone says, "What do Unitarian Universalists believe?" and you answer, "Oh, we believe whatever we want to," that's not quite true. There are a lot of things we do not believe in. We don't believe in limiting people because of their race or color, for example. We don't believe in restricting people on the basis of gender. We don't believe in excluding people because of disability. We don't believe in denying rights to those whose personal preference or lifestyle is different from the norm, so long as that lifestyle doesn't infringe on other people's rights. We don't believe in destroying the environment. We don't believe that injustice and poverty are just unfortunate accidents that we don't have any responsibility to do anything about. Those are some very definite limitations on freedom of belief in this church, and those are some of them. These are rather different from limitations of belief in some other churches. You should not be a Unitarian Universalist if you're a Christian who doesn't think atheists belong here. You should not be a Unitarian Universalist if you're an atheist who thinks Christians don't belong here, or Buddhists, or psychics, or pagans, or spiritualists. Remember, the criterion for membership here is humane living. The rest is a matter of individual choice. You should not be a Unitarian Universalist if you want all the answers, because we don't even know the questions. Finally, you should not be a Unitarian Universalist if you can't stand name calling. You are likely to get it by staying here. When you tell people you're a Unitarian Universalist, some of them will seize on the more sensational aspects of this church. Oh, you're that atheist church. Or you're the people who worship flowers. Labeling is a price you pay and a risk you take in belonging to this church. If it's any consolation, Unitarians and Universalists have had a long history of being labeled and vilified, and of responding with courage that comes from faith in the human race. From the days when UUs fought that respectable institution called slavery, to their battle for women's rights to vote and their struggle for civil liberties. My thanks to all who have stuck it out. Our video presentation today is by our homeboy, Reverend Aaron White.
Well, last week in church, Reverend Cantor talked about the many reasons why people come to church at all, why he comes to church, and he talked a little bit about his first visit to a Unitarian Universalist church in a long time in his young adult years. He had grown up in a Unitarian Universalist church, but had taken a break, as some people do. And I thought I would start today's service about the basics of who we are by telling you what I encountered the first time I came to a Unitarian Universalist church. I've been born into a nominally Protestant family. We went to a Methodist church in Grand Prairie. I was baptized in a Southern Baptist church, my own choice. And I left the church for some time after that and didn't think I was going to come back. So I was surprised when I found religion again in college. I was attending Austin College, a Presbyterian liberal arts college in Sherman, Texas. And I had entered with dual degrees in philosophy and religion and theater. And I had entered college as a fundamentalist atheist. I was certain there was no God, not for me, you, or anybody else. I didn't like the word and thought religion was for people who needed a crutch and couldn't use their intellect. I came in with some bias and a lot of ego, arrogance, and ignorance. I thought I was going to be the first atheist Christian theologian. I would tear it apart from the inside. Funny thing is, about people who really care one way or the other about something, usually means it's important to them. And it ended up being important to me. In my theater work, I was participating in a play called Corpus Christi, written after Matthew Shepard was killed, and it portrays the person of Jesus as a gay man in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1950s. Under the question, whom do we crucify now? I got the role of Jesus. And the repeated experience of entering the narrative of someone in a community who would give up their life for a cause of radical inclusion made me start to question the kind of things I had thought and said about religious people. It made me approach with a lot more humility the kind of ignorance and arrogance that I had used in my own bias. And that was what was on my mind when I was talking to my theater professor about religion at the cast party for this show afterward. And she said, "Well, you sound just like a Unitarian. You should come to my church." And I said, "I do not go to church." She said, "Well, just try once." I went to her church, which was a lay-led Unitarian Universalist congregation. They didn't have a minister. It was about 40 people. And they rented a room that was a classroom in the Presbyterian church across the street from my college. So I got up the courage to walk that 50 feet across the street and go into their worship service one afternoon. And when I got there, I opened the door, and it was 40 of my college professors. And me. And I thought, oh, there's something about this place. The person at the door was Scotty Johnson, who greeted me that day. a woman who's been a member of our church now in an odd role reversal. She became a seminarian and has now completed seminary. She was a member here. But Scotty was the greeter at the door of the church that day, handed me my first order of service, and welcomed me in, and then afterward did what I thank her for doing. She treated me like I was real. She didn't think that I was some college student who wouldn't have commitment, time, money, or passion. She said, I'm glad you're here. And if you want to stay involved in this lay-led Unitarian Universalist fellowship, well, first we're going to go clean the dishes, because that's church. And nobody cleans your dishes for you at church, so let's go. I went to the kitchen, and as we were washing dishes afterwards, she said, oh, also, there's an adult education class that you're supposed to go to after this. I'll see you there. She told me, if you do get committed and join here, we expect you to pledge, something that actually feels generous. And then she said, also, we're lay-led. That means you're probably going to preach this year. I loved her for it, because I've watched how churches, some of ours included, have treated children, youth, and young adults as if somehow their participation was less than the adults, or expected less of them. Had they not expected full 100% participation of me, I probably wouldn't have come back. They thought I was real. And I was compelled by that place because they asked me to merge grace and inclusion with responsibility. I had been told that I was loved unconditionally before. And I had been told that I had a heck of a lot of work to do on myself and the world. But never before in a community had I been told, you are loved unconditionally, you've got a lot of work to do, and we'll help. As an 18 or 19-year-old young man, that was important to me. They said, you have a role in the healing of the world, and it starts now. You won't be surprised to know that Scotty also said to me, and if you're going to stick around, you should know the history of this place. This religion didn't start when you showed up. It's way older than you. It's the religion of many of the founders of our country. You should learn it if you want to participate here. And so she bought me a book, Our Chosen Faith, and gave it to me and said, this is your homework. I read it and I was engaged. I read about this faith, which was the merger of two liberal branches of Protestant Christianity. The Unitarians on one hand, who were liberal Christians that believed Jesus was a human being, not God, that humans were born innately good, and that religion wasn't about going to heaven, it was about building a soul over time. They called it salvation by character. These are people like Emerson, Thoreau, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. On the other side of our history were the Universalists. These were Christians who believed that no loving God would ever condemn any part of creation to hell. One famous Universalist, Hosea Ballou, said that in the relationship between God and people, God is not the dissatisfied party. Religion wasn't about getting people into heaven, but getting heaven onto the earth. The Universalists said you had better get to loving your enemies right now because you are going to spend eternity with them in heaven. They believed in radical acts of inclusion, kindness, justice, and love. And in 1961, those two groups joined and became Unitarian Universalism, a non-creedal, covenantal, participatory faith with its roots in the Christian tradition, but which looks for wisdom in anywhere we can find it. Now, there are some people in our faith who have lived lives that impacted who we are so much that it's hard to talk about this place without talking about them. Emerson's one of them. Now, the story we tell about Emerson often in this faith is that he was kind of a cranky intellectual critic who offered his critique of the church and then walked away. It's not entirely true. Emerson was born in 1803, right when Unitarianism was on the rise, a historic rise in our culture. Something called the Unitarian controversy was happening at Harvard. The president of the seminary, the president of the university, and major chairs were elected to those positions, and they were all Unitarians. It was a problem for the status quo, and it was called the Unitarian controversy. These Unitarians are taking over Boston. Emerson was born. His parents, his dad, was a Unitarian minister. His grandfather was the minister of a Unitarian church. His grandfather, William Emerson, was the minister of First Parish in Concord, Massachusetts during the Revolution. He watched the shot heard round the world out of his window, and he called it the Battle of My Backyard. So Emerson's kind of stuck in this life as a Unitarian minister from the get-go. He goes to Harvard and then to Harvard Divinity School, and he starts his job at Second Church of Boston. Right after he starts, his wife, Ellen, she's 18 years old, they're newlyweds. She died of tuberculosis within about 2 years of their having been married. He takes it really hard. He says in his journal, a year after she died, that he went to her tomb, opened the casket to see her body and prove that she wasn't alive anymore. The year she died, he quit the church. He quit being a minister. He said in his journals, I've come to the conclusion that to be a good minister, I have to leave the ministry. And in his resignation letter to the church, he told them that it was about communion, the ritual of the Lord's Supper, bread and wine. He said, these are empty rituals. They don't mean anything, and I can't do them with integrity anymore. He was pretty blunt. Later, he goes on to become one of the most famous people in the United States, the equivalent of a rock star. Writers and ministers got to have that back then. And he goes and he's invited to give the graduation address at Harvard Divinity School. And he's looking out among a few dozen people who are about to take jobs in Unitarian churches, and he offers one of the most scathing critiques of our religion ever uttered. He says the religion is corpse cold, that this over-intellectualized group of people are arguing over literal translations of the Bible, believing that miracles either happened or didn't, and if you think that's the question, you're missing miracles. He said Jesus was important because he knew he was a son of God, and so are you. A child of a holy, infinite spirit that moves throughout all creation. And then he really trashed a prominent preacher in the area. So that everyone knew what preacher Emerson was talking about in that divinity school address. Because everyone knew where he went to church. It was like if Oprah went to your church. Everybody knew, and they knew what minister he was talking about too. He's not invited back to Harvard for 30 years. Now, we often tell the story of this guy, one of the most central founders of what it means to be a UU today. Unitarian Universalism looks a lot more like what he would have asked for than the religion he was critiquing. We tell this story that somehow he got upset, offered his critique, picked up his marbles, and walked away. But that's not the case. How does he know what that preaching was like in the church? Unless he was in the church. We know that Emerson, after he left the ministry, before he delivered the address and after, attended the First Parish in Concord, that very church where he hated the preaching, week after week. His family owned a pew, as all families, wealthy families did. Back in that day, you bought your pew, kind of like you bought your house. The rich people sat up front. It was an honor to sit up front back then. The rich people sat up front, and they bought their pews. And the people of color and the poor sat in the balcony. Even though many of our churches advocated for abolition, they were not integrated in the 1830s. Not most of them. And so Emerson made a statement every Sunday by buying his pew but leaving his seat empty and sitting in the balcony with people of color and with the poor, week after week. So what I see in his life is not the value we give him of, oh, you're supposed to be a rugged individualist and think what you think, and to heck with anyone else, and I'm out of here if you don't agree. This was a guy who did the exact opposite. He said, I have to keep my integrity as an individual And yet I know that this religion is a lot bigger than my opinion. I'm one of the most famous people in the world. And I'm still going to show up. I'm still going to give money. I'm still going to be a part of this community, even though I don't agree. I don't even like the place sometimes. That's a value that says our church is bigger than one person's opinion. On the other side was this guy, George de Benneville, a Universalist that I talked about a few months ago. At the age of 12, he was sent to be a sailor because he was kind of a hard person to live with. They sent him out on the seas. He has a series of engaging experiences with black African Muslims in which he realizes that all the stories he's been told about them are not true. That in fact, he's less compassionate, less engaged, less just than they are, and that God must love all people. He starts preaching Universalist sermons in the mountains and in the woods of Germany in the night, because it was a heresy. He has a fever. He's placed into a coffin. In the old days, they didn't bury you immediately just in case you weren't dead. And so he has this fever dream. He's pronounced dead for 2 days, lying in a coffin in his brother's house. In this fever dream, 2 angels take him through a Dante Alighieri-style hellscape, in which they take him from heaven all the way to the bowels of hell and back up again. In his fever dream, he meets Jesus and Adam and Eve and God. And God finally tells him, look, this is all an illusion. Any form of outward diversity is simply that. All humans are united in a divine soul. I love people of all sexes, races, and religions. Everyone goes to heaven. Go preach the good word. So he wakes up, stands out of his coffin, and goes to preach the good word. He gains a following, as one might. He's arrested a few times, given the death penalty, narrowly escapes. You should read his biography. Basically, he makes it to America and the colonies. And there, he lives a life of deeds, not creeds. And in fact, he's the first person in our tradition to say that. He says, we will be judged by our deeds in the world, not by our creeds. He has these radical, inclusive gospel services in his house where anyone from any religion can preach. He trades and engages in medicine with the native tribes around him, advocates for full legal equality for all races and all genders. And eventually, when the Revolutionary War comes to his house, the Battle of Germantown is on his property. 2 British officers are killed, and no one will bury them because they're enemy occupying forces. But he says, well, you know, in a fever dream, God told me that all people are equal, loved equally, and go to heaven forever, so you can bury them next to me. And if you go to his grave today in Pennsylvania, you'll find George de Benneville, his wife, and 2 enemy British soldiers buried next to him. His life to me shows that you can't say on Sunday that you believe in a God that loves everyone equally, people that are radically at home in their bodies in the universe, and then on Monday, discriminate. It says that you can't talk about love and justice and then be really cruel to one another in a classroom after church. That our actions will be how we're measured and not what we say we do or don't believe. So people like that handed us this religion that's now a covenantal church and not a creedal church. A creedal church is a church or religion you join because you say you believe something. A covenantal church is a church where you make a promise about how you're going to live together. And that's our church. We've made a promise. Every week we say, thus do we covenant with each other. Now, when you talk about this place to others, I would suggest that instead of saying what we're not, which some of you might have done, or giving your personal opinion as if that was what Unitarian Universalism was, which is also tempting, I would suggest talking about how this free covenantal faith challenges you to be a different kind of person. It would be like if you went to an Italian restaurant and the waiter came to the table and said, good news, I'm not going to serve you Mexican food while you're here today. You'd be confused. He would say, I know you've had bad experiences with Thai food before, and so I won't mention Thai food, nor will I serve it to you while you're here. You'd be confused. And yet often when we describe Unitarian Universalism, we begin by telling people all of the things we won't say or do. It's confusing. To describe this place with our personal opinions is kind of like describing America on your political beliefs. If someone asked you from a foreign country, tell me about America, and you said, I'm a Democrat, I live in East Dallas, I love baseball and ice cream, they would say, well, that's interesting, but I don't know anything real about America. You would describe our history, our values, the kind of people and practices we're encouraged to become. And so when people ask me, what I tell them is, we are a free faith rooted in the progressive branches of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We take that tradition seriously, but not literally. We affirm that people experience what we call God in many ways, that everyone is worthy of love and justice without exception, and that religion is not about what happens when you die, but how you live on earth. At its best, this place challenges me to be more inclusive, humble, kind, generous, just, loving, patient than I have ever wanted to be in my whole life. We have 2 services on Sunday, 10 and 11:30. You're welcome to join me. If you want to participate here, chances are you're going to hear some version of what Scotty Johnson told me. You are good, perfect in the eyes of the holy, worthy of as much love as we can muster, and you have serious work to do on you and the world. You're going to be challenged in this place to sing words and hymns you don't believe because the person next to you desperately needs to hear them today. You'll be challenged to show up and keep giving like Emerson did, even when you don't agree with what is said from the pulpit. Because you only agree with what's said every Sunday in a creedal church, not a covenantal faith. If you take this place seriously, it can and will change your life. You'll be challenged to be more patient, humble, kind, loving, generous, accepting, just, and giving than you ever thought was possible. I know it because it's happened to me. May it be so for you. Amen.
The offering that we take each Sunday isn't just a stale habit. It's an opportunity to recommit to this place and to this people. Our offering is an affirmation, a yes. When we give, we say yes to something we value. With our gifts freely given, may we say yes to the values of this church. May our offering help us practice Unitarian Universalism within and beyond our congregation as tools to empower our mission.
Just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to life. Though with pain I made my way, still with hope I meet each day. If they asked what I did well, tell them I said yes to life. Just as long as vision lasts, I must answer yes to truth. In my dream and in my dark, always that elusive spark. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to truth. Just as long as my heart beats, I must answer yes to love. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept on loving you. If they asked what I did well, tell them I said yes to love. Tell them I said yes to love.
I invite you to rise in body or spirit for the benediction and extinguishing the chalice. Be ours a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Its profession of faith, divine living. Please join me in saying the words to extinguish our chalice. The words are in the morning program should you need them. We extinguish this flame, not the truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we're together again. Go in peace.